The rhythmic mechanical beep of a heart monitor was the only sound keeping the silence of the VIP wing from collapsing. Outside, the night was a wall of black glass, smeared by the violent, relentless lash of a Category 5 hurricane. Lightning ripped through the sky over the city, casting sharp, skeletal shadows across the pristine white walls of Saint Jude Memorial Hospital. Inside room 402, 6-year-old Toby lay perfectly still, his small chest rising and falling in time with the artificial puffs of an oxygen respirator. His skin was pale, almost translucent under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every 4 seconds, the machine delivered a breath. Every 4 seconds, it bought him a little more time. Suddenly, a deafening crack of thunder shook the entire concrete foundation of the building. The lights flickered once, twice, and then vanished. The steady hum of the ventilation system died instantly. In the pitch blackness, the heart monitor let out a long, terrifying, continuous whine. Down in the subterranean depths of the hospital, the main power grid had just suffered a catastrophic thermal explosion. On the third-floor administrative hallway, Dr. Thomas, the chief administrator of St. Jude, slammed his fist against the useless digital security panel of his office. He was a man who measured life in balance sheets and prestige, his tailored charcoal suit unblemished by the sweat now pooling at his collar. "Where is the auxiliary backup?" He roared into his wireless radio, his voice cracking with a raw panic that rarely touched the executive suite. "We have 300 patients on life support. The ventilators in the intensive care unit only have 7 minutes of internal battery power. Get the German diesel generator online now." Through the darkness of the main technical bay, a figure moved with absolute, unhurried precision. It was Marcus. He wore a faded, grease-stained denim jacket, cuffs frayed from years of practical labor. While the hospital's junior technicians stumbled over their own feet, dropping flashlights and screaming over the sound of rising water in the lower levels, Marcus simply reached into his pocket. He didn't pull out an expensive digital multimeter or a corporate diagnostic tablet. He pulled out a slender, 5-inch rod of hardened carbon steel and a small, cheap plastic hourglass toy. "Step away from the control console," a young technician shouted, his voice trembling as his flashlight beam caught the grease on Marcus' hands. "You're just the laundry room mechanic. You don't have the clearance to be in the central generator room. You'll kill us all." Marcus didn't look up. He adjusted the collar of his worn jacket, his face illuminated only by the faint green status light of his son's plastic toy. "If I step away," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the chaos like a heavy blade, "this building becomes a morgue in exactly 5 minutes. Your digital manuals won't save you from a mechanical seizure. Out of my way." 4 hours before the storm tore the roof off the city, Marcus had been sitting on a cold metal stool in the dark, humid basement of the hospital's commercial laundry facility. The space smelled of industrial detergent and old steam pipes. For 3 days, he had been working 18-hour shifts, stripping down the ancient, oversized washing units that the hospital's accounting department had deemed too expensive to replace. Marcus didn't mind the grease under his fingernails. He didn't mind the dull ache in his lower back. Every turn of his heavy wrench was $1 toward the massive stack of red notices sitting on his kitchen table. His true world was upstairs, confined to a small bed in the pediatric ward. Toby, his 6-year-old son, had been born with a rare, degenerative congenital heart defect. The medical system called it an uncompensated ventricular anomaly. Marcus called it the reason he woke up breathing every morning. During his brief 30-minute dinner break, Marcus had walked up the back stairwell to room 402, carrying a small paper bag. Toby had been sitting up, his eyes bright, despite the dark circles underneath them. "Did you fix the giant steam machine, Dad?" Toby asked, his voice small but full of a profound, unshakable pride. To Toby, his father wasn't a manual laborer or a low-wage contractor. He was a magician who could command iron and fire, a man who could make old, dead engines sing with a single touch of his bare hands. "The steam machine is running perfectly." Buddy, Marcus smiled, his rough, calloused palm gently resting against his son's forehead. He reached into the paper bag and pulled out a small, blue plastic hourglass. It was a cheap toy, the kind you buy at a pharmacy counter for 99 cents. Toby's face lit up as he took it. "I timed the sand, Dad," Toby whispered, turning the toy upside down. The fine, pale grains began to fall through the narrow plastic neck, dropping one by one into the lower chamber. "It takes exactly 60 seconds for the top to become empty. The doctor said my heart needs a big operation soon. He said time is running out. But if I keep turning the sand over, we can stay here forever, right?" Marcus' throat tightened. He looked at the small plastic toy, then at his son's fragile frame. "We don't need forever, Toby. We just need enough time for me to fix it." The door to the room had slammed open then. Dr. Thomas walked in, flanked by 2 senior billing administrators and the head of security. He didn't look at Toby. He didn't look at the small plastic hourglass. His eyes fixed instantly on Marcus' grease-stained denim jacket, his lip curling with a subtle, well-practiced disgust. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of human warmth. "I've just reviewed your account with the financial committee. Your primary insurance policy has been officially flagged and suspended due to a structural clause in your previous employer's bankruptcy filing. The legal department has closed the file." Marcus stood up slowly, towering over the administrator. He kept his hands at his sides, his posture perfectly still. "The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning, Dr. Thomas. The specialist from Boston is already flying in. My son cannot wait another week. His mitral valve is collapsing. The hospital cannot absorb a $150,000 deficit for a non-employee," Thomas replied, adjusting his gold cufflinks with a clinical indifference. "We operate on strict regulatory logic, not sentiment. If you cannot provide a certified bank guarantee or a cash deposit by 8 o'clock tonight, the specialist will be reassigned, and your son will be transferred to the state municipal facility across the river. The state facility doesn't have the pediatric life support equipment to survive a level 4 transport," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "Moving him right now is a death sentence." "Then I suggest you find the money, Mr. Vance," Thomas said, turning toward the door. "But until then, please remove your tools from the laundry corridor. You're a maintenance contractor, not a guest. Your presence in the medical wings is a violation of our sterile environment policy. Security will escort you to the basement." Marcus had looked at Thomas, at the clean, uncayosed hands, the expensive watch that had never known a day of real work. The absolute certainty of a man who believed his title made him superior to the human beings who built the world around him. Marcus didn't argue. He didn't beg. He simply reached down, took the small plastic hourglass from Toby's bedside table, and walked out. By 7 o'clock, the wind outside had transformed into a feral scream. The rain did not fall. It drove sideways, hammering against the thick glass of the hospital basement windows like a barrage of small stones. The river at the edge of the property had breached its banks 20 minutes prior, sending torrents of muddy, debris-laden water into the lower parking structures. The municipal grid across the river, the very facility doctor Thomas had threatened to send Toby to went dark first. A massive blue flash lit up the western horizon as a substation exploded, leaving half the county without power. Marcus sat in the dim light of the laundry maintenance room, the heavy steel wrench resting across his knees. He didn't look at the rising water near the floor drains. His mind was calculating numbers. $150,000. To a man who earned $35 an hour replacing steam valves, that number wasn't just a debt. It was an impossible mountain. The legal system had locked his late wife's modest life insurance policy in a bureaucratic knot that would take months to untangle. Months he did not have. Toby's heart was an engine running on its last few cylinders, its timing belt frayed to the point of snap. The heavy metal door to the maintenance corridor flew open, banging against the concrete wall. Chief Engineer Henderson burst into the room, his white uniform shirt soaked with sweat and rain. Behind him were two junior technicians, their faces pale, holding waterlogged technical manuals. "Vance," Henderson shouted, his voice high-pitched and strained. "Get your gear, Doctor. Thomas wants all hands in the central mechanical bay. The lower drainage pumps are losing pressure, and the automated fuel valves for the backup system are throwing an error code. Move it." Marcus stood up, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the room. He didn't hurry. He picked up his canvas tool bag, ensuring his carbon steel rod and Toby's blue plastic hourglass were secured in his breast pocket. "The fuel valves aren't throwing an error because of the storm, Henderson," Marcus said calmly as he walked past the panicked engineer. "They're throwing an error because you haven't purged the condensation lines from the underground tanks since last winter. The fuel is freezing the electronic actuators." "Don't lecture me on system inspect, Vance," Henderson snapped, struggling to keep up with Marcus' long strides through the flooding corridor. "I have a master's degree in industrial systems management from MIT. You're a third-party mechanic who changes gaskets. Just follow orders and keep your mouth shut." When they reached the central mechanical bay on the sublevel, they said the atmosphere was chaotic. The room was the size of a commercial hangar, dominated by two massive 16-cylinder German-built diesel generators, painted a stark, military green. Each unit was capable of producing 2,000 kilowatts of electricity, enough to keep the entire medical complex breathing. But right now, both machines were dead, their massive steel blocks cold and silent. Dr. Thomas was already there, standing on the dry iron catwalk above the control floor, his expensive leather shoes ruined by the oily water below. He was shouting into his phone, but there was no signal. When he saw Marcus enter behind Henderson, his eyes narrowed. "Henderson," Thomas bellowed over the sound of a roaring exhaust fan. "Why is this man here?" "I told security to clear all non-essential personnel from the technical wing. This is a restricted high-voltage zone." "He's here to haul the heavy cable drums, Doctor," Henderson lied quickly, trying to shield his own incompetence. "The automated digital switching system isn't responding to our override codes. We're trying to manually flash the PLC circuit boards from the backup terminal." Marcus looked up at Thomas on the catwalk, then turned his gaze to the massive digital control panel of Generator Unit 1. The touchscreen display was dead, its dark glass reflecting the flickering yellow light of the emergency flashlights. A faint, acrid smell of burnt copper and silicon drifted from the top vents of the enclosure. "You can flash the circuit boards all night, Henderson," Marcus said, his voice completely level, carrying a weight that forced the room to silence. "But it won't do anything." The lightning strike didn't just trip the main breaker. The electromagnetic pulse induced a high voltage, surged straight through your ungrounded digital telemetry lines. Your pale city computer is a lump of melted plastic inside that box. Thomas stepped down from the catwalk, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and desperation. Listen to me, technician. I don't care about your amateur diagnosis. We have exactly 4 minutes before the internal batteries on the ICU ventilators exhaust their reserve capacity. If these engines don't start, people die. Henderson, reset the digital breaker. It's not a digital problem anymore, Dr. Thomas, Marcus said, stepping in front of the control panel, completely blocking Henderson from touching the switches. The computer is dead. If you let him try to force a digital start with a shorted control board, the starter motors will draw max amperage until they weld themselves shut. Then these engines will never run again. Get out of my way, Vance, Thomas snarled, stepping into Marcus's personal space, his finger pointing sharply at Marcus's chest. You are an hourly laborer. You don't understand the legal or financial liability of what is happening here. One more word of insubordination, and I will have security throw you out into the storm personally. Marcus didn't blink. He stood like an iron pillar against the administrator's fury. Then, from the overhead speaker system, a crackling, battery-powered emergency voice broke through the noise. Central Bay, this is pediatric ECU. The battery's reserves on room 402s and 405 are down to 12%. The patients are entering acute respiratory distress. We need power now. Thomas' face drained of color. Room Corsenos 2, Toby's room. Marcus didn't wait for an order. He didn't ask for permission. He dropped his heavy canvas tool bag onto the flooded floor with a loud splash. The time for corporate hierarchy was over. The world had returned to its raw, mechanical reality, and in this realm, Marcus was the undisputed sovereign. Henderson, Marcus commanded, his voice shifting into an absolute authority that left no room for dispute. Go to the auxiliary tool locker. Fetch me a 24mm manual box wrench, a bottle of hydraulic fluid, and 2 heavy gauge copper jumper coblos. If you argue with me, I will leave this room and let you explain to the board why you let this hospital go dark. Henderson looked at Thomas, then back at Marcus' icy, unmoving expression. The master's degree from Might offered no answers for a melted computer board. Without a word, the chief engineer turned and ran toward the tool locker. Marcus approached the side panel of Generator Unit 1. He didn't use a key. He took his heavy carbon steel rod, jammed it into the manual latch mechanism, and threw his weight against it. With a loud, metallic snap, the heavy steel door swung open, revealing the massive, intricate maze of fuel lines, high-pressure injectors, and mechanical governors beneath the engine's skin. The junior technicians gathered around, their flashlights shaking. What are you doing? One of them whispered. You can't run a digital generator without the electronic control unit. The timing sequence is managed by the microprocessors. Engineers don't care about microprocessors, Marcus said, his hands already moving over the fuel pump linkages with a speed that left the technicians staring. Engineers care about fuel, air, and compression. If the computer can't tell the injectors when to open, I'll tell them myself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Toby's blue plastic hourglass. He placed it carefully on a small, vibrating ledge near the primary fuel manifold, securing it with a piece of heavy industrial tape. The pale sand inside began to trickle downward, a silent analog clock counting down against the digital death of the hospital. Thomas watched from the shadows, his hands shaking as he held his useless phone. This is madness, he muttered to himself. He's going to destroy a $2 million power plant. Doctor, a quiet voice spoke from the entrance of the bay. It was Sarah, the senior charge nurse from the administrative wing, her uniform stained with water from the leaking roof. She was holding a satellite radio that was sputtering with static. I finally got through to the regional emergency command center. They managed to ping our location. They want to know if Kakisu Chung Vance is on site. Thomas frowned. Who? Marcus? He's just a maintenance contractor. No, sir, Sarah said, her voice trembling as she read the transmission log on her clipboard. The command center just pulled his federal profile. 10 years ago, before he retired to take care of his sick wife, Marcus Vance was the chief systems engineer for the Atlantic Aerospace Rescue Fleet. He's the man who designed the mechanical backup survival systems for the military's deep-sea salvage vessels after the Great Northern Blackout. The federal coordinator said if Marcus Vance can't start those engines manually, no one on this continent can. Thomas looked up, his jaw dropping slightly, as he stared at the man in the grease-stained denim jacket. The laundry room mechanic he had tried to humiliate hours ago was a legendary specialist whose work was studied in the very manuals. Henderson had dropped in the mud. The atmosphere inside the central mechanical bay shifted from chaotic panic to an absolute, breathless stillness. The word passed among the junior technicians like a low current. The man standing before them was not a simple maintenance worker. He was the engineer who had written the very protocols they failed to understand. Marcus did not acknowledge the shift. His focus remained locked on the iron beast before him. Henderson returned, panting, dragging a heavy metal kit containing the requested tools. He laid them out on a dry rubber mat, his hands shaking so violently that the 24-millimeter wrench clattered against the iron grid. I found them, Chief, Henderson said, unconsciously adopting a title of deference. But the pressure line to the primary actuator is completely blocked by emulsified water. The fuel won't flow through the automated injectors, even if we bypass the electronics. Marcus knelt in the oily water, his face inches from the high-pressure manifold. The engine block was radiating a suffocating heat, the residual temperature from its brief, failed ignition cycle reaching nearly 90 degrees Celsius. It's blocked because the electronic heater coil is dead, Marcus said, his eyes scanning the mechanical linkages. We don't have time to flush the lines. We do it manually. He picked up the heavy wrench and tapped a brass valve on the side of the engine block. A sharp hiss of pressurized air escaped, carrying the smell of stale fuel. Henderson, take the jumper cables. Connect the positive terminal of the starter battery directly to the manual fuel solenoid override. We are going to spark the injection cycle by hand. But Chief, one of the junior technicians interrupted, his voice cracking with fear. If you override the solenoid manually, without the computer regulating the pressure, you risk a hydraulic lock. The cylinder heads could shatter. The explosion will rip through this entire basement. The ECU ventilators have 2 minutes left, Marcus said, not turning his head. His calloused fingers gripped the hot metal lever of the manual fuel pump. We take the risk. Stand back. Dr. Thomas stepped forward, his face pale, his expensive suit jacket discarded, somewhere in the mud. He looked at the blue plastic hourglass taped to the engine frame. The sand was halfway through its second cycle. He looked at Marcus' broad back, at the steady, unhurried precision of his hands, the absolute certainty of the administrator's world. A world governed by digital signatures, financial liability, and administrative power had evaporated. He was completely dependent on the raw, practical skill of a man he had treated as an inferior. Marcus, Thomas said, his voice, stripped of its clinical coldness, reduced to a hollow whisper. My daughter. She is in the neonatal ward on the second floor. Her incubator is on that same circuit. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, his grip tightening on the heavy wrench. He did not look back at Thomas. "Keep your mouth shut, doctor, and let me work." Marcus wedged the carbon steel rod into the manual throttle assembly, using his body weight to force the mechanical governor into the open position. The metal creaked under the immense pressure. Sweat poured down his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he did not move a single muscle out of place. The sheer physical resistance of the 2,000 kilowatt engine was fighting against him, trying to lock itself down into a cold, dead status. "Now, Henderson," Marcus barked, "touch the wire to the solenoid terminal. 3 seconds only." "No." Henderson leaned over the battery box, his breath catching in his throat. He touched the raw copper end of the jumper cable to the terminal. A violent, blinding blue spark exploded into the darkness, illuminating the stark, determined lines of Marcus' face. The massive starter motor groaned, a deep, mechanical growl that vibrated through the concrete floorboards. But the engine did not catch. The sand in the blue hourglass continued to fall, grain by grain, indifferent to the lives hanging in the balance upstairs. The silence that followed the failed starter groan was heavier than the storm outside. Henderson fell back against the wall, his face covered in black grease, his eyes wide with despair. "It's no use," he whispered. "The pressure is dropping too fast. The manual bypass isn't holding." Dr. Thomas dropped to his knees on the wet concrete, his hands over his face. The reality of his failure was absolute. The system had broken, and all his wealth, his authority, his corporate logic could not buy him 10 seconds of electrical power. Marcus remained standing. He reached up and turned Toby's blue plastic hourglass upside down for the third time. The sand began its downward journey again. 60 seconds. "The pressure isn't dropping because of a leak, Henderson," Marcus said, his voice entirely calm, entirely steady. He reached into his denim jacket and pulled out a clean cotton rag, wiping the grease from his hands with a deliberate, slow rhythm. "It's dropping because you're waiting for the engine to tell you when it's ready. In an analog system, you tell the engine when to run." He turned to Thomas, his piercing gray eyes locking onto the administrator's trembling form. "Doctor, you told me earlier tonight that you operate on strict regulatory logic. You told me my son's life was a matter of balance sheets. Right now, your system is dead. The only thing that exists in this room is iron, fuel, and time." Marcus stepped up to the primary manual fuel lever, a massive steel handle that required 80 pounds of pressure to move. He wrapped his thick, scattered fingers around the cold iron. "I spent 20 years in the North Atlantic pulling men out of burning hulls, while your type was signing executive performance bonuses. I don't need a computer to tell me when an injection cycle is balanced. I can hear the timing in the valve seats." He looked down at the plastic hourglass. "Henderson, get back on that terminal. When the sand hits the quarter mark on this chamber, you hold that spark. Don't look at the gauges. Look at the sand. If you let go early, we lose the starter." Henderson scrambled back to his position, his fear completely consumed by the absolute command in Marcus's voice. The junior technicians lined up behind him, their hands reaching out to hold the heavy high-voltage cables steady against the vibration, forming a human chain of labor beneath the shadow of the giant machine. Thomas looked up through his tears, watching the man he had called a mountain contractor take full, undisputed control of the hospital's survival. Marcus Vance wasn't just a specialist. He was the anchor of the entire institution, the only barrier between life and death for hundreds of souls upstairs, including his own child. The realization of his own smallness, his own utter uselessness in the face of true capability, struck Thomas like a physical blow. Marcus leaned his entire weight against the heavy fuel lever, his muscles straining against the immense hydraulic pressure of the internal pumps. "Get ready," Marcus whispered, his eyes locked on the tiny, falling grains of pale sand. 3, 2, 1. "Spark it," Marcus roared. Henderson slammed the raw copper wire against the terminal. A violent cascade of blue and orange sparks erupted, tearing through the dark, damp air of the generator bay. The starter motor didn't just groan this time. It shrieked under the massive rush of unmitigated electrical current. The 16 giant pistons inside generator unit 1 began to churn against the cold, viscous oil, fighting the heavy, dead inertia of the system. The heat radiating from the exposed manifold rose instantly to a scorching 95 degrees Celsius. The skin on Marcus' bare forearms, pressed tight against the vibrating steel governor linkage to hold the timing manually, began to blister under the intense thermal blast. Small beads of sweat boiled off his skin the moment they formed. His teeth were clenched so hard his jaw ached, his eyes never leaving the blue plastic hourglass taped to the frame. The pale sand was rushing down through the narrow neck, a tiny torrent of stone measuring the final seconds of human life, 3 floors above them. "Hold it steady, Henderson," Marcus yelled, his voice strained as the raw mechanical force of the engine tried to wrench the iron lever out of his grip. "Don't you dare let that cable slip." The junior technicians threw their entire upper bodies onto the high-voltage cable drums, their own boots slipping in the rising, oily water on the floor. They were no longer thinking about corporate rules or administrative protocols. They were holding onto Marcus' rhythm, anchoring themselves to the terrifying, magnificent strength of a father who refused to let his son's time run out. Upstairs, in room 400, the digital screen of Toby's respirator went entirely blank. The internal backup battery had died. The small, rhythmic puff of air that had been keeping the boy's chest rising ceased. The nurse, Sarah, scrambled in the dark, her hands searching for the manual resuscitator bag, her heart hammering against her ribs as she counted the seconds in the dark. "Come on, Marcus," she whispered into the blackness of the pediatric ward. "Come on." Down below, the sand in the upper chamber of the hourglass hit the absolute bottom. Marcus let out a guttural scream of pure, concentrated effort and shoved the massive fuel throttle handle past its safety stop, forcing an unnatural amount of diesel directly into the compression chambers. He didn't look at a digital dashboard. He felt the exact microsecond the fuel met the pressure through the iron rod beneath his hands. Crack. A sound like a small cannon shot echoed through the concrete bay. A cloud of thick, black exhaust smoke billowed from the relief valves, blinding everyone in the room. Then the cold, dead iron didn't just rattle, it woke up. The 16 cylinders caught the flame simultaneously. A deep, deafening, earth-shaking roar exploded from the heart of generator unit 1, a steady, magnificent 2000 kVA rhythm that flattened the sound of the hurricane outside. The massive flywheel spun into a blur of perfect, kinetic energy. Instantly, the heavy automatic transfer switches on the main wall let out a series of loud, metallic snaps as they forced the emergency current through the hospital's primary circuits. Above them, floor by floor, the darkness was driven back. First, the subterranean corridors flickered with brilliant white light. Then, the administrative suites, the emergency rooms, and finally, the intensive care units blazed back to life. The steady, comforting hum of the massive ventilation system returned, purging the stale air from the building. In room 402, Exactly 7 seconds after the internal battery had failed, the digital heart monitor chimed back to life with a strong, rhythmic beep. The ventilator delivered a deep, pressurized breath of oxygen into Toby's lungs. The boy's pale chest rose, his eyelids fluttering slightly in the bright light as his oxygen saturation levels on the screen stabilized at 94%. Sarah let out a breath she felt she had been holding for an eternity, her hands trembling as she set down the manual resuscitator bag. "He did it," she whispered, looking at the ceiling. "The mechanic did it." Down in the mechanical bay, Chief Engineer Henderson dropped the jumper cables into the water, his arms completely numb, his face covered in black soot. He looked at the massive generator running at a perfect, flawless 1800 RPMs. He looked at the digital diagnostics board, which was now rebooting under the clean, steady power generated by Marquez's manual override. "The frequency is perfectly stable at 60 Hz, Henderson whispered, his voice full of a religious awe as he turned to look at Marcus. Without a computer board, he balanced the entire turbine frequency by hand. Dr. Thomas was still on his knees in the shallow water. He didn't care about the grease ruined on his thousands of dollars trousers. He looked up at the light bulbs burning brightly overhead, then at the massive machine that had just saved his institution, his career, and his own flesh and blood on the second floor. The weight of his own arrogance crushed him. He had spent his entire life believing that people like Marcos were just line items on an expense report, disposable cogs in a machine designed to generate prestige for men in suits. Yet, when the world stripped away the titles and the money, the only thing that had stood between his daughter and a cold grave was the blistered, grease-blackened hands of the man he had tried to evict. Thomas slowly stood up, his legs shaking. He walked toward Marcos, his head lowered, the clinical authority completely gone from his posture. He stopped 2 feet away from the engineer, looked at Marquez's raw, bleeding 40 arms, and then, before his entire junior staff, the chief administrator of Saint Jude Memorial Hospital bowed his head until it nearly touched his chest. I have no words, Marcus, Thomas choked out, his voice cracking with a genuine, sun-varnished shame. I am sorry for everything. Marcus didn't look at him. He slowly reached out, peeled the heavy industrial tape from the generator frame, and picked up Toby's blue plastic hourglass. He wiped a streak of black oil from the smooth plastic surface with the corner of his wet denim jacket. The sand inside was safe, still and quiet. Get your staff to check the secondary water pumps on the western wall, Henderson, Marcus said, his voice quiet, but still carrying the absolute authority of the room. The river is still rising. The automated systems won't save you if the cellar floods. Yes, Chief, Henderson said instantly, turning to lead the junior technicians into the outer corridors without a single moment of hesitation. Marcus turned his back on Dr. Thomas and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors, his boots splashing softly in the water, his tool bag slung over his shoulder. He had an engine to check upstairs. The heavy double doors of the pediatric intensive care unit swung open with a muffled thud. Marcus stepped into the corridor, his heavy boots leaving faint, oily tracks on the gray linoleum floor. The bright overhead lights shone down on him, exposing the raw reality of what had just occurred in the basement. His denim jacket was torn at the shoulder. His face was smeared with carbon soot, and his forearms were covered in angry, red thermal blisters from the heat of the generator manifold. Dr. Thomas followed 3 paces behind him, completely silent. The administrator looked like a ghost of his former self. His tie was gone, his white shirt was stained with grease, and the cold, regulatory detachment that usually defined his eyes had been replaced by a raw, hollow, meti. At the nurse's station, Sarah looked up from her monitors. The moment she saw Marcus, her professional composure cracked. She stood up slowly, her eyes tracking the injuries on his arms. "Marcus," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "The ventilator. It came back on. Toby is stable. His oxygen levels are holding at 96%. Marcus didn't speak. He simply nodded, once, a brief tight movement of his jaw, and walked past the desk toward room 402. Before he could reach the handle, Dr. Thomas stepped forward. He didn't intercept Marcus with his usual authoritative stance. Instead, he stood slightly to the side, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He looked at Sarah, then at the two floor physicians who had just emerged from the central chart room. "Dr. Addis," Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the smooth, polished timbre he used during board meetings. It was flat, exhausted, and completely earnest. "Cancel the municipal transfer order for Toby Vance immediately. Wipe the administrative flag from his financial file." The physician blinked in surprise. "Sir?" "The billing department closed the file an hour ago because of the insurance suspension. The state transport team is already on standby across the river." "I don't care about the billing department, and I don't care about the state transport," Thomas said, his voice rising with a sudden, sharp intensity that made the staff turn their heads. "Prepare the primary surgical theater on the 4th floor. Contact Dr. Chen at the helipad. Tell him the emergency grid is fully stabilized, and he is to begin the mitral valve reconstruction the moment the pre-op labs clear. Now." Thomas turned back to Marcus, his eyes dropping to the small, blue plastic hourglass that Marcus was still clutching in his blistered hand. The administrator reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a heavy, leather-bound corporate checkbook. With a trembling hand, he unscrewed his gold fountain pen. "Marcus," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking as he began to write. "The hospital's operational insurance fund has an emergency discretionary limit. I am signing a certified corporate voucher right now. $150,000. It covers the specialist from Boston, the theater fees, and the post-operative recovery care. Your son's surgery is fully paid for. You don't owe this institution a single cent." Marcus looked at the leather-bound book, then at the numbers written on the white paper. He looked at Thomas's face. The face of a man who spent his life believing that every human problem could be resolved by shifting numbers from one ledger to another. Slowly, Marcus reached out with his left hand and gently pushed the administrator's wrist back down. "Keep your money, Dr. Thomas," Marcus said, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the quiet corridor. "I didn't start those engines for your corporate voucher, and I didn't save your hospital for a handout." Thomas stared at him, his mouth opening slightly. "But your son, the surgery. You can't afford the specialist without this." My son will have his surgery because I am going to earn it," Marcus said, his gray eyes turning cold as iron. "I have 48 hours of contract maintenance remaining on your commercial laundry units. You will pay me my standard hourly wage, $35 an hour. Not a cent more, not a cent less. And you will allow the specialist to do his work because your medical license demands it, not because of a piece of paper." He turned the handle of room 402 and stepped inside, closing the heavy wooden door behind him, leaving the chief administrator of the hospital standing in the bright hallway, holding a useless checkbook in his hand. The interior of room 402 was quiet, filled only with the steady, reassuring click-puff of the respirator. The morning sun was just beginning to break through the gray, retreating storm clouds outside, casting a soft, golden light across the small bed. Toby was awake. His small hand was resting on the white sheet, his fingers moving weakly. When he saw his father walk through the door, his pale face lit up with a fragile, beautiful smile. He didn't see the black grease on Marcus's face. He didn't see the painful blisters on his arms. He only saw his dad. "You fixed it, didn't you?" "Dad," Toby whispered, his voice muffled by the clear plastic oxygen mask. The lights came back on. I heard the big engine singing in the floor. Marcus walked over to the bed, his large, imposing frame suddenly softening as he sat down on the small metal chair. He laid his tool bag on the floor with a soft click. Carefully, using only his fingertips to avoid rubbing his blistered skin against his son, he placed the small blue plastic hourglass onto Toby's chest. "The engine is running fine, Buddy," Marcus said, his voice dropping into a gentle, warm register that no one in the basement would have recognized. "The sand didn't run out." Toby looked down at the toy, turning his small wrist to watch the pale grains begin to fall. Once more. "I knew you wouldn't let it stop, Dad. The doctor said the storm was too big, but I told him my dad is stronger than the storm." The door opened quietly behind them. Dr. Nomas walked in, accompanied by Dr. Chen, the pediatric cardiothoracic specialist who had just arrived from the flight line. Thomas had changed his shirt, but he wore no jacket, and his posture remained entirely clear of his usual executive pride. He looked at Toby, then at Marcus. "Mr. Vance," Dr. Chen said, stepping forward to review the electronic chart hanging at the foot of the bed. "The emergency power gave us the stability we needed to run the full arterial mapping. Your son's heart is ready. We are moving him to Theater 4 in 10 minutes. I've personally reviewed the case, and I can assure you he is in the best hands possible." Marcus stood up slowly, stepping back to give the medical team space. He looked at Dr. Thomas, who was standing near the window, his arms crossed, watching Toby with an expression of quiet, profound relief. As the nurses began to unlock the wheels of the pediatric bed to wheel Toby toward the surgical wing, Thomas stepped into Marcus' path. He didn't offer a handshake. He knew Marcus's hands were too injured to take it. Instead, he pulled a sealed cream-colored envelope from his pocket and laid it quietly on the bedside table. "Marcus," Thomas said, his voice steady but full of an undeniable respect. "The corporate board held an emergency digital meeting 30 minutes ago. Chief Engineer Henderson submitted his formal resignation, effective immediately. He stated in his report that he is no longer qualified to manage an industrial infrastructure that he does not understand." Thomas paused, looking down at the floor for a brief second before looking Marcus dead in the eye. "The board has unanimously approved a direct, unadvertised appointment. We want you as the Director of Central Infrastructure and Safety for the entire Saint Jude Medical Network. The position includes a full executive salary, a dedicated technical budget, and comprehensive, unalterable medical coverage for your entire family, permanent and retroactive." Marcus looked at the envelope on the table. He didn't pick it up. He looked at his son, being wheeled through the door, Toby waving to him with a tiny, brave hand from the gurney. "I'll consider the offer, Dr. Thomas," Marcus said calmly, his voice returning to that slow, measured, mechanical rhythm. "But right now, my shift in the laundry room isn't finished. I have 2 steam valves left to pack before the morning delivery arrives." Marcus walked down the back stairwell, his heavy tools clinking softly in his canvas bag. He didn't look at the administrative offices as he passed them. He didn't look at the digital message boards listing the names of the corporate donors. He walked back into the damp, industrial quiet of the basement laundry room, picked up his heavy iron wrench, with his blistered fingers and went back to work. The world is full of men who believe that value is something written on a business card or stored in a high-yield bank account. They believe that power belongs to those who sit in high rooms, signing papers and directing the labor of others from behind a clean desk. But when the sky turns black, when the digital systems melt into useless glass, and when the air in the machines begins to run cold, the titles disappear. In the dark, the world doesn't care about your wealth. It cares about the strength of your hands, the clarity of your mind, and the depth of your devotion to the people you have sworn to protect. A father's true wealth isn't measured by the money he leaves in a bank. It is measured by the time he buys for his children through the raw, unyielding power of his sacrifice.